Hello to all my first and sixth period classical humanities students. Um, I'm sorry to be speaking to you under these circumstances. It's an odd thing after 18/19 years of teaching to be recording lectures. Who would have thought a couple of weeks ago we would be in this situation? But here we are. I hope you all are well. I hope your loved ones are well. And I hope that you can get some meaning out of these lectures. What I'm thinking of doing here, I'm thinking of recording about 20-minute length lectures related to the material in the slideshows where we left off. First period, you of course were being lectured by Miss Stearns. Sixth period, you were with me. In both cases now, we're at a similar level. You were recently discussing the Roman Republic, the style of governance, and comparing that with the American Republic. This is, of course, part of the larger goal here to look at the legacy of the Roman Republic, of Roman society in general, and bringing that forward to later Western civilization, and of course to the United States. And as you know, we're building up and leading towards a DBQ assessment on this topic. We're going to go ahead with that in both classes. As I mentioned in a previous post, ultimately we're assessing your writing. I think that's something we can still aspire to do. Hopefully you guys will be able to tackle this work at home. For first period, you can expect to get an assignment sent to you during the week at some stage by Ms. Stearns, while sixth period you will get an assignment from me. To go along with these lectures, I'm going to put up questions in Google Classroom, and you will also find, I will also try and put up some suggested readings. What I'd like to do for the first lecture, just for a few minutes, is to recap on the links between the Roman democratic tradition and the American one, especially because in the final days when you got physical worksheets, many of you were not around for the worksheet connecting between the founding fathers and the Romans. And yes, I'd like to touch base on some of those connections. Right, let's start. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to bring it through to those thoughts. I'm not going to go through the slides bit by bit again. We'll just talk here about some of those deeper connections. We have here similarities with US government, the balance of power both in the Roman Republic and in the US Republic. They aspired towards ensuring that no one person or group could dominate. Thus, as you will know, in the modern US government, we have two houses in Congress, and we have a president and a Supreme Court. But the Romans similarly also had these institutions. The Senate represented the wealthy elites of Rome. They had full control over foreign affairs. And from the Senate, they would appoint a council who'd only rule for 1 year. Now, two councils to only rule for 1 year. So they were really careful about not letting one person dominate for a period of time. Now, the ordinary people of Rome, the plebeians, also had a say because they could elect tribunes, they could veto measures and pass their own laws. And of course, both went on to become major military powers, which is the main topic of our lecture today, to talk about the Roman military. Before we move on to that, let's transition from the idea of the military via George Washington, because George Washington is a figure who also, like many of the other founding fathers, was deeply influenced by the Romans. In the worksheet, a couple of the more difficult questions looked at the connections between Caesar and two lesser known Roman figures today. They were Cincinnatus and Fabius Maximus. Now, looking first at Cincinnatus, Cincinnatus was a Roman general who, in a time of great crisis, during the early years of the Roman Republic, was called from his farm to lead Roman army against its enemies. He was given dictatorial powers. That is, he was given the powers of a tyrant, if you will, to try and command the country in a time of crisis. And when he defeated Rome's enemies, he promptly gave up those powers and returned to his farm. Washington modeled himself on Cincinnatus because after he had led the victory of the Americans, the Patriots, against the English, he responded by retiring to his home at Mount Vernon. He was then called upon again, of course, to become the America's first president, but he also ensured that he left office, declining any suggestion that he would serve a third term in office. In fact, Washington was very conscious of this connection and tried to cultivate it. And his followers started a society known as the Order of the Cincinnati, which was an order basically of American veterans and followers of George Washington. Another connection referenced in the worksheet was his connection to a general called Fabius. The Fabian strategy is quite simply a strategy that one can employ against a superior military power. And in the case of the Americans during the Revolutionary War, they, of course, were up against a superior power in the case of the British, and therefore Washington adopted the so-called Fabian strategy, which was retreating, lightly skirmishing, and then retreating again in order to draw a superior enemy into the countryside and thus into more vulnerable locations where they could be subject to guerrilla attacks and so forth. So we see here these connections between the Romans and the Americans. More traditionally, we also can see that founding fathers such as Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson greatly admired the great democratic figures of the late Roman Republic, people like Cato the Younger and Cicero, who both tried to put up a defense of the Roman Republic when it was being turned into an empire by Julius Caesar and later his adopted nephew Octavius, otherwise known as Augustus Caesar. So those connections are very deep and are worth mentioning, and certainly you could use much of that material in an essay on the Roman legacy. Right, so now let's have a little look at the Roman military and see what we have here. So the question to ask here is why is the Roman military more studied than the Greek or Egyptian? I barely spent any time on the Egyptian military and a little bit of time on the Athenian hoplites, and I talked about the Spartan values and the legendary Spartan commitment to military virtue. However, the Roman military are far more greatly studied because, of course, they created such an enduring empire. Check out this map. Look at the vast territories it covered. And I should say, if you don't know what the countries in red are, you probably should know them. Pause this lecture, go to a map of Europe and Mediterranean and Middle East, and get a good idea of what these countries are. This is a vast territory, including many different peoples of different religions and faiths and backgrounds and ethnicities. And for the Romans to conquer and subdue these people and create an enduring empire was an incredible achievement. Now, morally, it is not as straightforward. The Romans brought many fine things to these areas, but they also exploited these provinces. and were not shy about using a brutal force to get their way. Um, One thing to consider is that the date here, 117 AD, is showing the Roman Empire at its zenith, that is, at its highest and farthest point. It didn't, of course, always stay at this size, nor, of course, did it start off as this. It grew from Rome and then through the surrounding Italian tribes and so forth. It was, the old saying goes, Rome wasn't built in a day. So keep that in mind. Now, so the Roman military, arguably then the most successful military in all of human history. So I do think it's worth having a closer look at what that entailed. Here's another look at our map. Again, we'll look at the names. Interesting to note that, you know, some of the names that we now use for the entire continent, like here, for example, a name for the entire continent of Africa was a name for a region. And other names too that are still used today. Moving on. So here we have a video on the Romans, Roman military technology and tactics. I would advise you to go into the slideshow and watch this video, and three questions accompanying that. One, how are the gladius and pilum used? So questions with their basic weaponry. Two, to describe how the Roman armor changed over time. And again, remember, the Roman Empire lasted for 1,000 years. So therefore, this was not a stationary or static thing. It changed, it evolved, it advanced, and you will see that in the video. It's a short video. And then three, provide three examples of Roman technological brilliance from the video. If you look in, you'll see all the wonderful examples of Roman engineering, Roman technology, and yes, very informative and a short video, so well worth watching. Now, the structure of the military as well is interesting. It was highly organized, divided into legions, which is the largest unit. And the legion then could be subdivided into centuries, which, by the way, had 80 men, not 100, which I could forgive you for thinking. And this core element of the army was made of Roman citizens. Roman citizens, that is, people who got to vote, people with full citizenship rights, people who were free members, voting members of the Roman Republic, both patricians and plebeians. Over time, of course, the concept of what it meant to be Roman expanded. Eventually, Roman citizenship was granted in the late era of the Republic to all of the Italian peoples. And later, it was expanded further to include peoples who were formerly seen as foreign, once those countries and regions had been firmly absorbed into the empire. They in time were given citizenship. Now, the legions were supported by auxiliaries, that is, additional forces. In particular, worth noting are the artillery and the cavalry. The artillery, of course, using projectiles, long-range weapons. They really utilized the brilliance of Roman technology and engineering. You saw that in the video. If you haven't watched the video, again, please check that out. And then cavalry. The Romans were not as famous for their horsemen, but this is where it gets interesting, because the Romans absorbed many of the best fighters from former enemies, that in time, when these regions were subdued, when they were brought within Roman civilization, so to speak, that the Romans often adopted from these places fighters, tactics, strategies into their auxiliaries. So, for example, Spanish cavalry. Spaniards are known for their horsemen. Slingers from Syria. Of course, you know Syria being known for the region too. If you think about slingers, think about the story of David and Goliath. And so many examples of this. Archers, I believe, were from Crete. And so they became this formidable fighting force. Discipline was absolutely key to Roman success. It was often the case in battle that the Romans were outnumbered by their enemy, but yet they usually, not always, but usually prevailed. Why? Because they were so disciplined and so committed. Um, Fitness is a very important part of this, of course. The Romans would walk many, many miles a day. They would have to train and go on runs, bringing backpacks similar to like modern day, the real modern sense from the Romans. Now, discipline, of course, also includes punishment. Um, and that could be severe, very severe. In some rare cases, decimation would be used if a unit displayed cowardice. In this, an unusual occurrence, if a Roman unit, for example, a century, was to perform poorly, if they turned around and betrayed their colleagues or ran away in battle, decimation could be used. And decimation quite simply meant that 1 out of every 10 soldiers would be killed. So with this combination of technological brilliance, of Roman pride, of organization, of armor, and so forth, the Romans were hugely successful against their enemies. Now, how were soldiers paid? And why in this way? You see, I have a series of pictures here. And we have here on the right, the most obvious way, we get coinage. We get the Romans, especially in the late era, that is in the time of the empire, using coinage. A variety of coins, and you see here with various rulers on them. So soldiers could be paid in coinage. However, the two more interesting ways from our perspective are also on the left. We see here, the top left, this really interesting picture. What is it? Well, it's salt. And salt gives us the word salary, the modern day salary. The etymology, many words, of course, come from the Romans. The Latin language, which is the mother language to Spanish, Italian, French, Portuguese, so forth. And so salary, paid in salt. Why was salt valuable, you may ask? Well, salt, of course, was one of the few ways of preserving food, of giving flavor to food, of disguising the taste of food that had not been so well preserved. And so this was a useful way to pay soldiers. Finally, we have here a beautiful picture in the bottom left. And this, of course, is the Roman countryside. But it may not be Rome. It might be part of France, of Gaul, of Hispania, modern-day Spain, of Greece, of Asia, what we call modern-day Turkey. Because what the Romans would do in order to encourage and cultivate a sense of Romanness in newly won provinces, it would reward retiring soldiers, especially soldiers, plebeians, by giving them land in these far-flung lands. By doing this, they would then have a Roman presence in the area if trouble broke out. Right, guys, I see that I'm already running up here close on 20 minutes. So I'm going to keep it at that for today. I will post another lecture possibly later on in the week. Please look out now in your classroom for accompanying questions and some suggested readings, which you can do if you feel you have the time. Please, if you could all respond to at least one of the questions in the Google Classroom, please do so. 6th period, remember again, look out for assignment later on the week from me. 1st period, Miss Stearns will be in contact with an assignment. Until we speak again, I hope you're all well. If you have any great difficulties with this work or would like to reach out to me for any other reason, please feel free to do so. You know how to email me. You have my email address. Be well. Thank you.